Alright, so we all know how powerful some floodgates in the game are. God knows we've had some issues with the likes of there can only be one, skill drain, etc. Those cards are now either banned or limited, but we are still looking at an issue of floodgates. They're just lingering ones. These are cards like Droll and Logbird, Artifact Lancia, Dimension Shifter, Dimensional Barrier, and they are turning turns into coin flips. So in today's video, I want to break down what lingering floodgates actually are, what sorts of problems they pose for the game, why some of the most hated cards are still untouched on the ban list, and also ask a very important question. Are they destroying skill expression in Yu-Gi-Oh? Of course, like the video if you enjoy it, and feel free to share all of your thoughts in the comments. But do try and keep the conversation polite, of course. So let's talk about it. So before we dive into the impact of lingering floodgates, we have got to establish what they actually are. So if you check out Yu-Gi-Oh! Wiki, floodgate is actually an unofficial term for a card that is restricting players from performing certain actions. And for the most part, floodgates came in the shape of continuous trap cards. They were stuck on the field and prevented players from playing, pretty much. You all know how the likes of Goes a Match, Rivalry of Warlords, There Can Only Be One, ended turns completely. However, they come in all different shapes, and lately we've started seeing more and more problems emerge with the usage of so-called lingering floodgates. It's an effect that is applied and is lasting for a specific period of time. Usually that's until the end of the turn, sometimes even until the end of the next turn. We all know which card I'm talking about, our beloved Dimension Shifter. But all jokes aside, these are effects that essentially, once they are resolved, they can no longer be reversed. And a lot of times, there's also very little counterplay for those cards. Droll and Logbird is preventing adding from the deck to the hand until the end of the turn. Artifact Lancia prevents banishing. You can see the pattern. It's always preventing a specific thing and essentially paralyzing the player against which this card is used. And that is precisely why these types of cards are as hated as they are. And some players even go so far as to say they are essentially ruining the game. So let's break it down and talk about exactly why they are as despised as they are. And the number one thing is something I already alluded to. They are extremely uninteractive. If you take Dimension Shifter, for example, or any type of lingering floodgate hand trap, the only counterplays would be Called by the Grave, Crossout Designator. That's pretty much all there is. And Dimension Shifter was such a big problem because if it got played during the opponent's turn, there was no way for you to deal with it. And there are decks historically, like Kashtira, for example, Flunder, also one of the most beloved decks, right? that would play Shifter immediately as the first action and then proceed to do their turn because the deck was not hindered by the effect of Dimension Shifter whatsoever. And there was no way for you to counter that Shifter when it got played during their turn. So what ends up happening is those effects are completely turn ending. Some decks simply cannot play, meaning the only action they can do is say pass turn. These types of cards definitely represent a one-sided advantage, and sometimes they can completely hinder your strategy. But on the other hand, if your opponent does not draw into them, they are probably losing because your deck is as oppressive as it is. And that's actually the next issue I want to talk about. They aren't just annoying. Sometimes they feel completely necessary, and that is a big concern of many players because it just goes to show how bad of a format we are in once these types of cards see play, or rather have got to see play unless you want to lose. I've heard things like these being said a bunch of times, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. You will always hear someone say, oh, Joel is seeing play right now, or Shifter is seeing play right now, we are definitely in a bad format. Because Droll and Lancia and cards like that aren't seeing play because people think it's super fun to stop your opponent from playing. They are necessary. The decks they are meant to stop are that broken. And in a format where you're playing against the likes of Mitsurugi, for example, one search snowballs into this insane combo. And if you don't draw Droll, you kind of just gotta cross your fingers and pray that some of your underhand traps do enough, but it's not very likely. The main issue and concern of many players is that Konami lets some of these incredibly powerful decks and engines remain unchecked and bring complete and utter devastation to formats, so players are actually forced to run these uninteractive cards or lose. So I want to draw your attention to this. Artifact Lancia and Droll and Logbird are seeing play in more than 90% of decks at Netherlands Nationals, meaning these cards aren't just techs anymore. They are necessities, and I would go so far as to say they are actually survival tools. And with that, I also want to talk about something else, because having these floodgates in the meta gets really strategic on Konami's part. Let's talk about Dimension Shifter for a second. God knows we've been clamoring to see Dimension Shifter be banned or limited or just hit in some way for years at this point, but it got hit very, very late into its existence. And now let's talk about Lancia, Droll and Logbird as well, but I think Lancia is the perfect example because of Malice. Lancia is still at 3, and it was one of the most important cards to counter the Malice strategy. And a lot of times it would completely end the Malice player's turn where they could just pass and then you essentially win. But on the other hand, if you don't draw Lancia, they might just make this crazy end board that you're not beating anyway. So what did Konami do? They didn't hit Lancia, obviously. What they did was print support for Malice that specifically helps them play under Lancia. So what they're doing is power creeping these crazy lingering floodgates instead of actually addressing them. There's bound to be another format where Lancia is going to be extremely strong. So now, rather than fixing oppressive floodgates and hand traps, Konami just prints cards that effectively power creep them, render them a little more useless, and that's not fixing the problem, it's just strategic marketing. So then we find ourselves in this vicious cycle where they constantly print broken decks, we are forced to play broken cards that are really uninteractive and also toxic, and then Konami doesn't hit the floodgates, they just release support that ignores them. So we're constantly in this cycle of imbalance and we're paying for it with our own hard-earned money. And with that, I want to get back to talking about the format and whether or not they are destroying skill expression. Because what it comes down to is essentially a coin flip. Are you drawing Droll, or am I doing full Mitsurugi combo because you only drew like one ash and it doesn't do enough? It comes down to interactions that are variance based. And I do want to point out that there's a lot of players out there that prefer formats that are focused on decks with incredibly strong engines where non-engine doesn't play as much of a role. Take Tier Limits Shizo format, for example. And before you go crazy, because I know there's some of you out there that completely despise Tier 0 formats, there are historical examples where a lingering floodgate resolved, such as Abyss Dweller, which is now thankfully banned, but it also took years before the card was addressed, side note, and the player against which Dweller resolved was still able to win simply because of skill. So there are formats out there where lingering floodgates are not that big of a problem, but they are few and far between, and that's the main issue, because lately all we've been seeing is year after year and format after format of high variance where a lot of game wins and match wins at the end of the day are decided by which non-engine you draw, and that is a big concern. Situations like these also discourage deck diversity. There are plenty decks out there that are just collateral damage when lingering floodgates are ruling the format as much as they are. Take Ritual Beast, for example, or Christron, which is a more competitive deck but still loses to some of the lingering floodgates. Ritual Beast, though, is a great example of this. Are you really comfortable with running this deck right now when you know there's Lancia, there's a bunch of other cards that just hinder this deck's existence? That's not a lone example. There are many decks out there that struggle and suffer because of this, and that's why a lot of times you don't see extremely diverse formats, because are you really going to try to play a deck that's gonna lose against most of the cards in every single player's side deck? So what can really be done? What are we as players supposed to be asking for? There are not a lot of outs to these cards. Call by the Grave is limited, Crossout Designator is limited, which is also fine because they were issues on their own, but that's not what today's video is about. Are we supposed to be pushing for the likes of Droll and Lancia to be banned or limited? Are we supposed to be asking Konami to not print decks that are incredibly broken or lose to a specific card? I think a really important thing is to be pushing for more ban list consistency, because if Abyss Dweller is banned, Shifter is limited, why are there other lingering floodgates still running around. And the same thing also happened with quote unquote basic floodgates, like the continuous trap cards. Some of them were still unlimited by the time others were limited or even banned. There's no actual consistency or a model that makes sense. So, lingering floodgates. They are slowly turning Yu-Gi-Oh! Into a game of luck over skill in a lot of instances. So with that, I want to ask you guys what you think. Are they necessary evils, or are they just plain toxic and should not exist? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments, and also don't forget to like and subscribe for more conversations like these. I really do hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you very, very much for watching it. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!